There are moments of cruelty so precise, so publicly delivered, that the room goes quiet before anyone fully understands what just happened. This was one of them. A formal Windsor Heritage Memorial ceremony. Hundreds of guests, cameras catching everything. Lady Louise Windsor, 20 years old, in an elegant black dress, hair pulled back, walking quietly to her seat. She had not sought this moment. She had not positioned herself for it. She was simply there, the way she always was, present, dignified, doing her duty. And then Camilla's senior courtier stepped forward. In front of everyone, he lifted the bronze nameplate engraved Lady Louise Windsor from her chair and dropped it into a wicker bin in the corner. Just dropped it. No hesitation. Replaced it with a nameplate for someone from Camilla's own circle. Louise stood in the aisle and watched her name thrown away like garbage while whispers rippled through the rows behind her and cameras caught every second of it. Camilla swept past her with a smile for the reporters. She leaned in close. Royal life requires knowing when to step back. Framed like advice. Delivered like a warning. And Louise, 20 years old, alone in that aisle with no one close enough to intervene, stepped back quietly, accepted it, let the ceremony continue without disruption. That moment of grace, in the face of that specific cruelty, is where this story really begins. Because somewhere across that room her father was watching. And Prince Edward, the quiet one, the patient one, the brother everyone had underestimated for decades, had just reached his line. The man nobody saw coming. Here is something worth understanding about Prince Edward before we go any further. People had been misreading him for years. They looked at his quiet demeanor and saw weakness. They saw a man who avoided conflict, stepped back from controversy, chose a private life when the rest of the family was generating headlines. They assumed that because he didn't fight publicly, he couldn't fight at all. They were wrong about that. There is a difference between someone who cannot fight and someone who chooses not to, until the moment actually demands it. Edward had spent years paying attention, watching, memorizing, storing things away with the patience of someone who understood that the right moment with the right documentation could accomplish more than any amount of public confrontation. He had watched Camilla's expansionism quietly for a long time. He had watched the way she moved through spaces that weren't entirely hers, the way her circle pushed outward, the way family assets were repositioned one quiet decision at a time. He had said nothing. He had waited. And then he watched his daughter's name get thrown in a bin in front of hundreds of people. That night, he went to his private study, and he started writing. What Edward drafted that night is being called a secretly sealed covenant, a binding legal order that stripped Queen Camilla of all her residency rights at Windsor Lodge and transferred them directly to Lady Louise. This was not an email. It was not a strongly worded letter passed through intermediaries. He melted red wax. He pressed his personal signet ring into it. He sealed the envelope in the old way, the way this family had been sealing decisions for centuries, and he sent it through proper channels before dawn. It was a statement inside the act itself. He wasn't operating outside the system. He was using the family's own historical legal mechanisms, their own protocols, their own ancient procedures, against someone who had clearly come to believe those mechanisms didn't apply to her. When King Charles found out about the covenant the following morning, according to reports, he simply sat and stared at his brother's red wax seal, completely still, because he understood something Camilla apparently hadn't. The covenant had locked every exit. Charles could not issue a decree to reverse it without directly violating the documented final wishes of Queen Elizabeth II. The trap wasn't built around emotion or anger. It was built around procedure, around paper, around the things Edward had spent years quietly learning. What he found in the archives. But the covenant was only the first move. In the days that followed, Edward went deeper. Midnight, the family's private archive, centuries-old oak cabinets, a flashlight cutting through the dark. He was looking for something specific. What he found was a leather-bound ledger from 1701, estate trust documents containing a clause about the transfer of Windsor property rights. More significantly, directly beneath that ancient text, there was a handwritten note, Queen Elizabeth II's handwriting, reaffirming the preservation of Windsor Lodge for, and this phrase is the one that lands hardest, service without ambition. Elizabeth had anticipated this. Standing alone in the archive with a flashlight and a centuries-old book, Edward understood that his mother had seen exactly this kind of move coming, and she had left instructions behind in her own hand, linked directly to the property Camilla was trying to claim. Then he found something that made his blood run cold. In the Windsor estate office safe, a thick dossier, confidential seal, prepared months earlier without the family's knowledge. Inside, detailed renovation plans for Windsor Lodge. Camilla's plans. The blueprint mapped out Windsor Lodge as a permanent private residence for her children and grandchildren during major royal occasions. Her bloodline, installed in a shared family asset, positioned as though they had always belonged there. And on one specific page, Lady Louise's memorial room, marked for demolition, to be replaced with a gaming room. Not a library, not a study, not anything. Nothing that could be defended as practical or purposeful. A gaming room, built on top of something that had been created to honor his daughter. When Camilla discovered that Edward had been in the archives and the estate office, she summoned him. Windsor Lodge, a large mahogany desk. Camilla seated behind it, twirling the bronze key to the residence on one finger. A deliberate provocation, a display of ownership, a reminder of who held access and who didn't. She accused him of treachery, of attempting to tarnish her honor, of sowing division in the palace. She threatened to use her media connections to isolate his family, to make them vanish from public events, to ensure they were quietly pushed to the margins in the same way she had pushed others before them. She expected him to fold. He was the quiet one. He always avoided conflict. He would back down. Edward didn't argue. He didn't explain himself. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a copy of the renovation blueprint, and placed it on the desk, directly on top of the spinning key. In a low, steady voice, he walked her through every page. The territorial plan, the conversion of family assets, the erasure of Louise's memorial room, the gaming room that was supposed to replace it. The key stopped spinning. Camilla's face went from pale to flushed because everything she had planned in secret was now sitting on the desk between them in black and white, undeniable. Her own documentation convicting her in front of the only person who had bothered to go looking for it. She had brought a key to a meeting. He had brought receipts. When Anne moved. Princess Anne does not enter situations lightly. She had been watching Camilla's expansionism for a long time, with the particular attention of someone who has spent 50 years understanding how this institution works and what it costs when its boundaries are violated. The ceremony, after Louise's name in the bin, after receiving everything Edward had found, the 1701 document, the renovation plan, the blueprint, Anne acted quietly, without calling meetings, without consulting courtiers. She went to the estate office and signed a special confirmation document certifying that Lady Louise fully met all conditions of a loyal patron according to the standards Queen Elizabeth II had personally established. This was the pincer movement. Edward's covenant came from one direction: legal, procedural, airtight. Anne's confirmation came from the other: family authority, honor, the direct invocation of the late Queen's standards and wishes. Camilla caught in the middle with nowhere to go. That night, Charles sat in his private study at Buckingham Palace, the 1701 ledger on one side of his desk, Anne's confirmation on the other. Then Camilla came through the door. She was crying, demanding. She needed him to issue a decree, to reverse Edward's covenant, to punish Anne, to fix it. And Charles had to look at his wife, the woman he had elevated to queen despite decades of public opposition, the woman he had chosen over everything, and tell her he couldn't do anything. His authority in this matter had been completely frozen. To tear up that covenant, to override what Edward had built on his mother's handwritten instructions, would be to shatter something that couldn't be repaired. Publicly, constitutionally, permanently. The husband who had given her everything was now helpless to save the one thing she had tried to take for herself. The afternoon, everything changed. 2 o'clock, crisp Windsor sunlight. A black car with royal insignia pulling through the gates. The estate management team stepped out in silence. No casual greetings. Solemn faces. The covenant activated. First, the staff roster Camilla had personally approved, canceled. Her trusted attendants, who had moved through Windsor Lodge the previous day as though they owned it, were informed they no longer had any right to be there. Then the security technicians approached the electronic panels at every entrance and began erasing the access codes, the codes Camilla and her network had used to control the residents. New codes were established, top-level encryption, and from that moment only 2 people held them, Prince Edward and Lady Louise Windsor. Sophie, Edward's wife, Louise's mother, watched the whole dismantling from the porch, belted wool coat, sorrow in her eyes, but underneath it, the resolve of a woman watching justice arrive for her daughter, late and imperfect, but real. She watched Camilla's courtiers panic as they realized the control system had changed, watched them moving through rooms they could no longer claim, throwing belongings into cardboard boxes, carrying out the remnants of an occupation that had just been formally ended. And then the sun began to set behind the ancient trees of Windsor Park. The senior courtier, the same man who had lifted Louise's bronze nameplate from her chair and dropped it in a bin without hesitation, walked toward Sophie. Pale-faced, shoulders down, carrying a silver platter, on it, the bronze key. He bowed. Sophie said nothing. She lifted the key from the platter, the soft clink of metal against metal. The sound of Camilla's presence at Windsor Lodge ending completely. The thing Louise did next. Here is the part of this story that I keep coming back to. Because Louise could have moved in. She had every right. The covenant was legal. The eviction was complete. The key was hers. Windsor Lodge was hers to do with as she chose. She didn't move in. She announced that Windsor Lodge would be converted into a retreat for the children of military families who had served the crown, and into the headquarters for carriage-driving charities. She took the property Camilla had spent months scheming to claim for her own bloodline and gave it away, not to herself. To children, to veterans, to charities. And in doing so, she made Camilla's defeat absolute in a way that no amount of confrontation ever could. You cannot fight someone who isn't fighting you. You cannot outmaneuver someone who takes the thing you were reaching for and places it out of reach of everyone, including herself. Louise didn't just win the battle. She made the battle irrelevant by removing the prize from the board entirely. On a quiet late afternoon, Camilla returned to Windsor Lodge alone. No courtiers, no attendants, no machinery of the position that had always surrounded her, just her. She moved through the residence she had planned to reshape for her family. She went to her old office, lifted a sentimental embroidered pen case, her last personal keepsake, and placed it in a small handbag. She stepped onto the main porch. Louise was waiting in the shadow of the awning. The two of them stood there in silence for a moment, and then Camilla, the woman who had swept past this girl at a ceremony with a cold remark about knowing when to step back, bowed her head, extended her hand, and surrendered the final key. No words, no argument, no noise, just the quiet transfer of something she had wanted very much, back to the person it had always been meant for. What this story is really about. There's a phrase that appeared on banners carried by people who gathered outside Windsor in the days that followed. The silent ones deserve to inherit too. It reframes everything. Louise never sought fame, never positioned herself as important, never demanded anything. She simply showed up, did her duty, absorbed a public humiliation to avoid disrupting a ceremony, and went on. That quality, that specific, unglamorous, deeply unfashionable quality of service without ambition, is the thing Queen Elizabeth II apparently spent her reign trying to preserve. The thing she wrote about in her own hand in the margins of a document from 1701. The thing she linked directly to Windsor Lodge and what it was meant to represent. And, in the end, it was not the ambitious ones who inherited it. It was the quiet ones. Edward, who spent decades being underestimated and paid attention the whole time. Anne, who spent 50 years doing the work without asking for recognition. Louise, who stepped back when a queen told her to step back, and then watched her father use that moment to change everything. Camilla disappeared into the twilight with a pen case and a bowed head. Louise stood in the light, a bronze nameplate in a wicker bin, a red wax seal on an envelope, a key passed from one hand to another on a silver platter as the sun went down over Windsor Park. That is what this story looked like from the outside. From the inside, it was something older and simpler. A question about what this family is actually for, about who earns the right to be part of it, about whether service without ambition still means anything in a world that rewards the opposite. Louise answered that question without saying a word. Now I want to hear from you. Did this story change how you see Lady Louise, or Edward, or what the royal family could still be? Drop your take in the comments. The conversation there is always worth reading. If this video moved you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel. And subscribe if you're not already here, because we tell royal stories with all the human weight they carry. See you in the next one.